Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on andragogy as it relates to adult learning. My name is Nicole Vargas, and today I will give you a brief history of andragogy. I'll review the 6 assumptions associated with andragogy, as well as provide some examples for how these assumptions may be evident in our real life adult situations. And lastly, I'll go over some strengths, weaknesses, and just general critiques of andragogy. So, andragogy is firmly rooted in humanistic psychology. And so, defined as the art and science of teaching, andragogy provides an appropriate approach to developing guidelines for adult education. Although the term andragogy was first used by a German educator named Alexander Kapp in the 1800s, it was later introduced to English speakers by Edward Lindemann in the 1920s. However, it wasn't until humanist Malcolm Knowles popularized the term in the 60s and 70s that he became known as the father of andragogy. So, andragogy attempted to differentiate between the assumptions that regarded children as learners and those that regarded adults as learners. And so, in the text Adult Learning, Miriam and Birma point out that there's a pedagogical model that's going to emphasize more on content, whereas an andragogical model would emphasize more on process. So there are 6 assumptions that Knowles defined in regards to andragogy. And so those are the 6 assumptions that we're going to go over today. The first of which is an adult's need to know. As adults, we need an understanding of why we would need to know something. So we question the need to know. We want to know what are the benefits. We want to know what are the risks if I don't learn this. We want to know why is it important? Is there a positive experience that will follow? Can we set goals and plans and what would that look like after I learned this? And so, as Miriam and Birma point out, this assumption goes hand in hand with another assumption that we'll discuss later, which is motivation. And so, if adults can see why it's important to learn something, generally our motivation to learn is much stronger. So, of course, our need to know also arises from different encounters or experiences that we've had. And that's another factor or assumption we'll discuss later. Now, for some real life applications here, you could have an adult that, let's say, has no desire to have children. Therefore, they would not have a need to know about, say, changing a diaper. However, this could certainly change if that adult were to unexpectedly become the guardian of another child, and they would have an immediate application there of needing to learn how to change that baby's diaper. For a more personal connection, I will add that as someone who never had a desire to be a nurse or do any type of medical treatment, I was quickly thrusted into needing to know how to care for a child with medical needs, as my daughter needed the placement of a feeding tube, which ended up being a 6-year journey. And that need to know was never existent until all of a sudden it was. And so learning to manage a feeding tube, how to place one, how to take one out, all of check placement. I mean, there were so many different factors that I had no prior knowledge of, but all of a sudden I had an immediate need to know and a real life application. And so that's how that could look in the real world. Another assumption is that as a person matures, his or her self concept moves from more of a dependent person towards a more self directed, independent person. So, that first assumption that people are going to mature and become more independent is evident where, as an infant, right, there's no way for an infant to survive without typically another adult there to provide those basic needs. But as young children, they're slowly starting to pick up things that they can do for themselves, but they're still, for the most part, dependent on that adult. to carry on, their thriving right in life. But as they enter their teenage years, they're going to have more independence, and then by young adulthood, people are generally expected to be responsible for their own lives, and so that self concept is sort of just slowly, gradually moving up the scale from completely dependent to completely independent. So that leads us to our next assumption, which is experience. So that adult going, along that spectrum is growing this sort of reserve of experiences, and that is our resource for future learning. So it's assumed that adults have more experience than children, and that could also lead to bias amongst those adults. And so we know that typically our learning is associated with our existing knowledge. What do we already know? And sometimes what we don't understand is that we have to unlearn things in order to move forward with learning something new. And that can be challenging for adults, who may be stuck in their ways and sort of unwilling to unlearn something they've already learned. And so an adult's accumulated life experiences are a rich resource for learning. And as we age, we have such a variety of life experiences, that no human really is alike in the experiences they have, that has led them into adulthood. Now, those experiences are the experiences that we carry into adulthood are also going to be what stimulates that need for learning. And so the next assumption is our readiness as an adult to learn. And this can look different depending on our social role. So Knowles believed that children had a more defined social role, typically that of just a student. They were there to be shaped and learn and just be a student. Whereas he pointed out that as adults, we tend to wear more hats, right? We tend to acquire more social roles. So we move from being children to perhaps parent, to full-time employee, perhaps employer, adult student, community member, all of these things. And so we engage in these multiple social roles, and the demand for these roles changes as we change. And so a young adult might be preparing for entering the work field, and learning different careers to find where he or she settles. Whereas a middle-aged adult is possibly learning to be more of a mentor or a supervisor in their field and learning how to manage others. Whereas an older adult may be trying to figure out, how do they stay current? How do they keep this job as they are learning to navigate working remotely through a pandemic? And so that takes us to orientation. So there's an assumption that this change in time perspective as people mature, from future application to immediacy of application. So there's a more problem-centered approach to learning, whereas children tend to have a more subject-centered learning style. And so we know that most adults are motivated to learn in order to deal with a problem that has an immediate concern, an immediate application needed. And so these issues can relate to those social roles we talked about, and then they intertwine with whatever our life experiences are. And so there's some caveats to consider, because some adults just learn to learn. They enjoy learning, and it's not necessarily that they're learning to deal with a problem. And on the other end of the spectrum, not all childhood learning needs to be subject-centered. And we'll talk a little bit about that and how it looks in 21st century learning. The last assumption is motivation. So Knowles argues that teachers teach dependent children who have extrinsic motivators, and that dependency begins to decrease with age, where adults are then typically driven by internal motivators. Now, Miriam and Birma point out that it's no surprise that these adults are motivated by internal factors. And so my example that you see here is a picture from Survivor, one of my favorite shows. And so some people enter the show not learning or not knowing previously how to build a fire. And yet, when you're in this situation, which is a fire making challenge to get into the final tribal council, where you have a chance of winning $1 million, all of a sudden you have some internal motivators, right, to get you to learn quickly how to build a fire. So I want to talk about some of the strengths, the weaknesses, and what the critics say. So most noteworthy, Miriam and Birma remind us that andragogy, as promoted by Malcolm Knowles, is considered the first systematic formulation that lays out the difference between children and adult learners. And so for that, andragogy contributed to the development of the field of adult education. And this was during a time when those that educated adults were struggling to establish their own identity, which was separate, they felt, from childhood educators. And so andragogy helped professionalize the field of adult education by establishing a knowledge base that was unique to adult learners. Now, there's this sort of ongoing debate, if you will, on how to classify andragogy. So is it a theory, a model, a philosophy, instructional model, tool, technique? And so there's very many people that have opinions about which category andragogy falls into, and even Malcolm Knowles himself eventually suggested that really maybe learning should just be conceptualized on a continuum where you have pedagogy on one side, you've got andragogy on the other, and then the weight is just placed along the way on our different learning situations and the needs that accompany it. So in a 2019 study I read by Achildes, there were a number of participants who believed that it was essential to make learning experiences student-centered. And so that's very much so appropriate for our current timing, where even in K-12 education, we are pushed to develop more student-centered approaches to learning, which goes against the assumption of Knowles that teachers teach dependent children and they are sort of the sage on the stage versus adults being student-centered. We're finding that those really tend to merge, and as Knowles later pointed out, some of his assumptions can actually apply regardless of the age of the learner. So he believed that some learners, they may naturally move from a more pedagogic to an andragogic perspective faster than others. And so, according to research that I read from Arifin et al., there's this choice of concept models in the learning approach, and that those concept models should be adjusted based on the characteristics of whatever field of education we're in. And so there are some approaches that may be more pedagogical and sort of adaptive to a children's learning, whereas there are going to be other models that require a more andragogical approach to build knowledge and skills and attitudes, whether it be in adults or children. So, like many of the early studies in psychology, Knowles's assumptions were based on research that was conducted by middle class white males. And so it's the assumption's reliability is being questioned. And so people believe that these assumptions couldn't possibly be reflexive, or reflective rather, on a more diverse, holistic, modern population of adults. And so there are many people that see the strengths behind andragogy and its foundation, as well as those that can sort of pinpoint where the theories and the concepts and the just philosophy of andragogy need to evolve. And so it's not something that needs to be written off, of course, but it's sort of a continuum, like we've mentioned before, where there are pieces of these assumptions that can be evolved into a more 21st century approach. And so I'd like to thank you for coming, and I would also like to credit the many sources that I referenced here to put this presentation together. So thank you very much.